The first breath Elias Thorne took after 6 months of silence tasted like ozone and sterile dust. It wasn't the cinematic awakening he might have once imagined. No gasp for air, no dramatic surge of light. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing realization that the darkness was receding, replaced by the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of a ventilator. For half a year, he had been a prisoner in a labyrinth of his own subconscious, a ghost drifting through a gray fog where time had no meaning. His last memory was the screech of tires on a rain-slicked bridge, the smell of burning rubber, and the crushing weight of cold metal. Then, nothing. Until now. His eyelids felt as heavy as lead shutters. He forced them upward, a millimeter at a time, until the blurry white world of a private hospital suite came into focus. He expected to see faces. He expected to see Julian, his eldest, perhaps pacing the floor with that anxious energy he'd inherited from his mother. He expected Sarah, his little girl, to be sitting in the armchair by the window, her nose buried in a book or her fingers dancing over a laptop. He waited for the warmth of a hand to squeeze his own, for a voice to cry out that he was back. But the room was hauntingly still. The only life in the space was the flickering glow of a monitor tracking his resurrected heartbeat. Elias tried to speak, but his throat felt like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. A low, guttural croak was all he could manage. It was enough, however, to alert the nurse stationed just outside the glass doors. She entered quickly, her footsteps soft on the linoleum. When she saw his eyes, actually seeing, actually tracking her movement, she froze, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might shatter him back into a coma. "Can you hear me?" He blinked once. A slow, painful affirmation. "Oh my God," she breathed, rushing to the bedside to check his vitals. This is a miracle. We were told. Well, the prognosis was very different." Elias struggled against the tube in his throat, his hand twitching toward it. With practiced efficiency, the medical team was summoned. The next hour was a blur of activity. The discomfort of extubation, the searing burn of water hitting his parched throat, and the constant, repetitive questions to check his cognitive functions. "Do you know what year it is, Elias?" the doctor asked. 2025, he rasped, his voice sounding like a stranger's. "And do you know where you are?" "Hospital. St. Jude's." "Good. Very good." The doctor looked at him with a mixture of professional pride and something else, pity. As the medical team filed out to update his charts, Elias grabbed the sleeve of the young nurse who had first seen him wake. "My children," he wheezed. "Where are Julian and Sarah? Call them. Tell them I'm awake." The nurse's smile faltered. She looked down at the clipboard in her hands, avoiding the piercing blue of his gaze. "Mr. Thorne, I'll check the contact logs. You just need to rest right now. Your body has been through an incredible ordeal." "No," Elias insisted, the first spark of his old, stubborn self flickering to life. "Call them now." He watched her go, but she didn't pick up the phone at the nurse's station. Instead, she went to speak with the head administrator. Elias waited. He watched the clock on the wall, each tick echoing in the silence of the room. 1 hour passed, then 2. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor. Finally, the nurse returned. She wasn't alone. A man in a sharp charcoal suit followed her, the hospital's legal counsel. "Elias," the man said, pulling up a chair. "It's good to see you back. I'm David Miller. We met briefly years ago when you were setting up your estate's primary medical directives." Elias felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Where are my children, David? Why aren't they here?" David sighed, opening a leather-bound folder. "Elias, after the 3rd month of your coma, the medical board issued a status of persistent vegetative state with a near 0% chance of recovery. Based on the power of attorney documents filed by your son, Julian, and supported by your daughter, Sarah, they petitioned the court for the dissolution of certain assets." "Dissolution?" Elias repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "They argued that the cost of your long-term care, combined with the stagnation of your estate, was not what you would have wanted. They claimed you would have preferred the family legacy to move forward rather than be consumed by hospital bills for a lost cause." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. "What did they do, David?" David cleared his throat, his voice dropping an octave. "The Thorne estate, the house in Oak Ridge, the land, the art collection, It was all liquidated 4 months ago. The property was sold to an investment group. The proceeds were distributed between Julian and Sarah according to the early inheritance clause they successfully argued in probate court. The room seemed to tilt. The house Elias had built with his own hands when his construction company was just a dream and a pile of debt. The house where his wife had taken her last breath, promising him that their children would always have a home to return to. The house with the height marks carved into the kitchen doorframe, tracking Julian and Sarah's growth over 20 years. Sold. They sold it, Elias whispered. While I was still lying here, they relocated you to this smaller facility once the primary estate funds were moved, David explained gently. They haven't checked in for quite some time, Elias. The last payment for this room was automated from a diminishing trust. Elias closed his eyes. He thought of the thousands of hours he had worked, the missed birthdays, the late nights at the office, the calloused hands, all of it for them. He had built an empire so they would never know the hunger he felt as a child. He had given them everything, and the moment his eyes were closed, they had treated him like a broken piece of furniture to be hauled away to the dump so they could pocket the change. I want a phone, Elias said. His voice was no longer a rasp. It was a blade. Elias, you should rest. I said, give me a phone. The nurse handed him a basic hospital mobile. His fingers, thin and trembling, remembered the numbers by heart. He called Julian first. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar, impatient voice picked up. I told you, I'm in a meeting. If this is about the charity gala, call my assistant. Julian, Elias said. Silence. The kind of silence that feels like the world has stopped spinning. Dad. Julian's voice was a frantic, high-pitched shadow of itself. That's not possible. Who is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? It's no joke, Julian, Elias said, his eyes fixed on the empty white wall. I'm awake, and I'm looking for my house. Do you know where it went? On the other end of the line, Elias heard a glass shatter. He didn't wait for an answer. He hung up and dialed Sarah. Hello, she answered, her voice bubbly, accompanied by the background noise of a high-end boutique. Sarah, it's Dad. The scream that came from the other end was one of pure terror, not joy. Elias handed the phone back to the nurse. He felt a strange, cold clarity washing over him. The grief was there, a vast ocean of it, but it was being rapidly covered by a layer of ice. They hadn't just sold his house, they had sold him. They had looked at his life and decided it was worth more to them as a line item in a bank account than as a human being. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built a city. They were weak now, but the mind that directed them was sharper than it had ever been. His children thought they had divided a dead man's spoils. They were about to learn that Elias Thorne was very much alive, and he was the one who knew where all the foundations were buried. The discharge from the hospital was not the triumphant return Elias Thorne had envisioned during his long sleep. There was no limousine, no flurry of apologetic children, and no home to return to. Instead, he sat in the back of a stale-smelling taxi, clutching a plastic bag containing his only possessions, a hospital gown, a pair of non-slip socks, and a temporary ID card. The driver kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, perhaps wondering why a man who looked like he belonged in a high-back velvet chair was heading toward a neighborhood that had seen better decades. You sure this is the place, pal? The driver asked, pulling up to a weathered iron gate. Elias looked out the window. His heart, still fragile from months of inactivity, skipped a beat. This was the place. But it wasn't his place anymore. The Thorne estate had always been a sanctuary of limestone and glass, nestled behind a curtain of weeping willows and manicured hedges. Now, the hedges were overgrown, looking like jagged teeth against the gray sky. The digital keypad at the gate was new, a sleek, black eye that blinked red as Elias stepped toward it. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the buttons. He entered the code he had used for 20 years, his late wife's birthday. Error. He tried Julian's birthday. Error. Sarah's. Error. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was a trespasser on his own land. He pressed the intercom button, his knuckles white. Who is it? A voice crackled through the speaker. Young, bored, and entirely unfamiliar. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm the owner of this property. There was a long silence, then a sharp, metallic click as the gate swung open just enough for a person to squeeze through. Elias walked up the long, winding driveway, his legs burning with the effort. Every step was a memory. There was the oak tree where he'd hung a swing for Sarah. There was the patio where he and Julian had argued about the boys' first business plan. At the front door, a man in his late 20s appeared. He wore a tailored tracksuit and held a smartphone as if it were a scepter. Elias Thorne? The guy from the news? The man asked, leaning against the doorframe of the house Elias had designed himself. I don't know what's on the news, Elias said, his voice cold and steady. I know this is my house. I built it. I paid for it. And I intend to go inside. The young man chuckled, but there was no malice in it. Only the casual cruelty of someone who held all the cards. Look, old-timer, I don't know what your kids told you, but I bought this place through a legitimate estate sale 4 months ago. The deed is in my name. The Thorne family took their check and ran. I've already gutted the West Wing for a recording studio. Gutted. The word echoed in Elias's mind. The West Wing had held his library, the collection of first editions he'd spent 40 years curating. My things, Elias managed to say. The books, the furniture, the portraits of my wife. The man shrugged. The kids took what they wanted. The rest? Most of it went to auction. Some of it ended up in the dumpster behind the garage. If you're looking for a memento, you're about 4 months too late. Elias felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. He turned away before the man could see his eyes glaze over. He didn't ask for a phone. He didn't ask for a ride. He simply walked back down the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath his thin shoes like the bones of his past. He spent the next few hours wandering the city. He was a man out of time. People hurried past him, their faces buried in their phones, oblivious to the ghost walking among them. He found himself at a public library, his fingers trembling as he sat down at a computer terminal. He searched for his own name. The headlines were a masterclass in betrayal. Asterisk, the fall of an architect. Elias Thorne declared brain dead. Asterisk. Asterisk, Thorne's siblings to spearhead new future after patriarch's tragic accident. Asterisk. Asterisk, the end of an era. Iconic Thorne estate sold for record $12 million. Asterisk. There were photos of Julian and Sarah at a charity gala, smiling for the cameras only weeks after the sale. Julian was wearing a watch that Elias recognized, a Patek Philippe he had intended to give him on his 40th birthday. Sarah was draped in silk, looking radiant. There was no sign of mourning. They weren't grieving a father. They were celebrating a windfall. Elias felt a cold, hard knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't just the money. It was the erasure. They had treated him like a spent battery, something to be discarded once it could no longer provide power. They hadn't even waited for his heart to stop beating before they began the feast. He opened his personal email, the one his children didn't know about. He had always been a man of contingencies. He had spent his career designing structures to withstand earthquakes and hurricanes. He would not let his own life be any different. Locked behind a triple encrypted layer was a folder titled Asterisk Foundation. Asterisk. Decades ago, when his company was first taking off, Elias had seen how money changed people. He had seen sons turn on fathers and partners bleed each other dry. To protect the core of his labor, he had established a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that were never tied to the Thorne estate. These were his emergency pylons, intended to be a final safety net for his children if they ever faced true ruin. He checked the balance. The numbers on the screen were enough to buy 10 Thorne estates. But as he looked at those numbers, he didn't feel relief. He felt a dark, simmering purpose. His children had proven that they didn't value the foundation he had built for them. They only valued the spoils. They wanted to move forward? Fine. He would help them move. He looked at his hands. The tremors were gone, replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness. He had one last task before the sun went down. He looked up the address of a small, discreet law firm in the garment district, one he hadn't used in years. They didn't know the new Julian Thorne or the successful Sarah Thorne. They only knew the man who had once built this city from the mud up. As he walked out of the library, the wind picked up, biting through his thin hospital-issue shirt. He didn't feel the cold. He was already thinking about part 3. He wasn't going to call them again. He wasn't going to beg for a room in their new mansions. He was going to become the ghost they were so afraid of. He hailed another taxi, but this time, he didn't give an old address. He gave the coordinates of a luxury hotel penthouse. Sir, that's a very expensive area, the driver cautioned. Elias leaned back into the shadows of the seat. Don't worry. I'm an architect. I know exactly what things are worth. And as the city lights blurred past, Elias Thorne began to draw the blueprints for his children's downfall. He had spent his life building homes for people he loved. Now, he would spend his remaining days ensuring that the people who betrayed him realized exactly what it felt like to have no home at all. The penthouse of the Grand Regency was a sanctuary of marble and silence, a stark contrast to the sterile, beep-filled purgatory Elias had inhabited for months. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city pulse below like a sprawling circuit board. In his hand, he held a glass of water, ice-cold, crisp, and real. He had spent the last 48 hours in a whirlwind of digital resurrection. With the help of Marcus Vance, a lawyer whose loyalty had been bought with decades of fair dealings rather than a quick payout, Elias had reclaimed his hidden identities. The Phoenix Group, a dormant entity he had registered in a tax haven years ago, was now humming with life. "They think they're playing chess, Marcus," Elias said, his voice regaining its resonant, gravelly authority. "But they've forgotten who taught them the rules." Marcus sat at a nearby table, surrounded by tablets and stacks of financial reports. "Julian's tech startup, Apex Neural, is bleeding cash, Elias. He's been using the money from the house sale to subsidize a lifestyle he hasn't earned. He's leveraged everything on a government contract he thinks is a sure thing." Elias turned from the window. "And Sarah? She's shifted into high-end real estate flipping. She's currently trying to close on a historical block downtown. She's overextended, relying on high-interest private loans, expecting a quick resale. She used her portion of your estate as the down payment." A thin, cold smile touched Elias's lips. "They're fragile. They've built their new lives on the assumption that the foundation, my corpse, would stay buried." "What's the first move?" Marcus asked. "Information," Elias replied. "I want them to feel a shadow before they see the wolf. Start buying up the debt on Sarah's downtown project through the Phoenix Group. For Julian, find out who his competitors are for that government contract. I want to become his most silent and most lethal rival." Later that evening, Elias did something he hadn't done in years. He put on a suit. It wasn't one of his old ones. Those had likely been donated or tossed, but a new charcoal wool masterpiece delivered by a private tailor. As he caught his reflection, he saw a man who had been hollowed out by betrayal, but reinforced with steel. The kindness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a calculating frost. He decided it was time for a ghost to make a public appearance. The venue was the Lumina Gala, a high society event Sarah had been bragging about on her social media. Elias arrived late, bypassing the red carpet and entering through a side entrance managed by a security firm he once consulted for. He stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, looking down at the glittering ballroom. There they were. Julian was at the bar, surrounded by a gaggle of young entrepreneurs, laughing loudly and gesturing with a glass of expensive scotch. He looked soft, his face slightly flushed with the arrogance of unearned wealth. Sarah was near the center of the room, draped in a gown that probably cost more than the hospital wing Elias had been moved to. She was preening, accepting compliments from a group of socialites. She looked like a queen who had just inherited a kingdom she hadn't helped defend. Elias walked down the grand staircase. He didn't rush. He moved with the steady, rhythmic pace of a man who knew the building's structural integrity better than anyone in the room. The shift in the room was palpable. It started with a few whispers. A waiter froze. An old business associate of Elias's squinted through his glasses, his jaw dropping. The ripple of recognition moved toward the center of the room like a shockwave. Sarah was the first to see him. She was mid-laugh when her eyes locked onto the figure approaching from the stairs. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room. "Dad?" she whispered, the word barely audible over the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Julian turned, his smile curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He took an instinctive step back, nearly knocking over a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Elias stopped 6 feet away from them. He didn't look angry. He looked like a judge. "You both look well," Elias said, his voice carrying through the silence. "The early inheritance seems to suit you. That's a lovely necklace, Sarah. Is that from the sale of the library? And Julian, that watch? I believe it was meant to be a gift for a man who had passed away. Since I'm clearly overstaying my welcome in this life, I hope it keeps good time." "Dad, this isn't the place," Julian hissed, stepping forward and trying to grab Elias's arm to lead him away. Elias didn't move an inch. He looked down at Julian's hand until the younger man pulled back as if burned. On the contrary, Julian, this is exactly the place. A room full of people who value appearance over substance. Your natural habitat. We thought, Sarah started, her eyes darting around the room as she realized the most influential people in the city were watching their downfall in real time. The doctors said you wouldn't wake up. We had to make difficult choices for the family. The family? Elias tilted his head. Which family, Sarah? The one I spent 40 years protecting? Or the one you two formed the moment you thought I was out of the way? You didn't just sell a house. You sold the memory of your mother. You sold my dignity for a seat at this table. We'll give it back, Julian whispered, his face pale. We can settle this quietly. Just come home with us. Home? Elias laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. You sold my home to a stranger who's currently tearing down the walls I built. You don't have a home to offer me. You only have the hollow shells of businesses you bought with blood money. Elias stepped closer, leaning in so only the two of them could hear him. I didn't come here for an apology. I didn't come here for a check. I came here to tell you to enjoy the view from the top while you still can. Because I am the one who built the ground you're standing on, and I've decided the foundation is no longer sound. He turned on his heel and walked away, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could hear the frantic, hushed arguments breaking out between his children behind him. As he stepped out into the cool night air, Marcus was waiting in the car. How was it? Marcus asked. The demolition has begun, Elias said, settling into the leather seat. They're terrified, and terror makes people sloppy. Julian will try to accelerate his contract. Sarah will try to flip her property faster. They'll start taking risks. And the Phoenix Group? Buy everything, Elias commanded. I want to own their debts by sunrise. If they want to live in a world where everything is for sale, I'm going to make sure I'm the only one buying. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the glittering lights of the gala behind. Elias Thorne looked out at the city. He had spent his life building things to last. Now, for the first time, he found a grim, cold satisfaction in the thought of something falling apart. The week following the Lumina Gala was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Elias didn't need to strike directly. He simply needed to tighten the noose and let his children's own panic do the work. Through the Phoenix Group, he had successfully acquired Sarah's high-interest mezzanine loans. He was no longer just an observer. He was her primary creditor. For Julian, Elias had leveraged his old connections to ensure that the government contract for Apex Neural was delayed for a comprehensive audit. Elias sat in the dimly lit corner of a high-end, discreet cafe, watching the street through the glass. Across from him, Julian paced like a caged animal. He had demanded this meeting, his voice cracking over the phone. When he finally sat down, his eyes were bloodshot, and his expensive suit looked lived in, as if he hadn't slept in days. What do you want, Dad? Julian asked, his voice a low, desperate hiss. Is this about the money? We can give you a monthly allowance. A generous one. You can live anywhere you want. Europe, the Caribbean, just stop this. Stop interfering with my business. Elias took a slow sip of his black coffee, the heat grounding him. Generous? You're offering me an allowance from the money you stole by selling my soul? You speak as if you're the benefactor and I'm the charity case. It wasn't stealing. Julian slammed his hand on the table, drawing sharp looks from other patrons. We thought you were dead. The lawyer said it was legal. We were just optimizing the assets. Optimizing. Elias repeated the word with a cold, hollow laugh. You optimized your mother's wedding ring into a down payment for a failed software company. You optimized my life's work into a fleeting moment of social status. You didn't just take the money, Julian. You took the choice. You decided I was worth more to you as a memory than a father. The audit on Apex, that was you, wasn't it? Julian's voice trembled. If that contract doesn't go through by Friday, I'm insolvent. I've put everything from the estate sale, into this. I'll lose it all. Then I suppose you'll have to find out what it's like to start with nothing, Elias said calmly. Just as I did. Except I had honor. You have a leased office and a mountain of lies. Before Julian could respond, the bell above the cafe door jingled sharply. Sarah marched in, her face a mask of fury and fear. She didn't even look at Julian. She threw a folder onto the table in front of Elias. "The Phoenix Group sent me a notice," she barked. "They've called in the entire balance of my construction loans. $10 million, due in 72 hours. Who are they, Dad? I know you're behind this. I've tracked the signatures back to Marcus Vance. How did you get that kind of money?" Elias looked up at his daughter. She looked so much like her mother when she was angry, but the spirit was different. His wife's fire was for protection. Sarah's was for possession. "I am a builder, Sarah," Elias said quietly. "Did you really think I put every cent I ever made into a single house? I built structures you couldn't even imagine. I built foundations that you weren't qualified to see. You were so busy looking at the gold on the walls that you forgot to check what was holding them up. You're ruining us." Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "We're your children. How can you be so cruel?" "Cruel?" Elias stood up, his height suddenly imposing. The frailty of the hospital bed seemed like a distant myth. "Cruel is selling a man's home while he is still breathing in a coma. Cruel is moving your father to a cut-rate facility because his maintenance was too expensive. Cruel is dividing a man's life into piles of cash before he's even cold." He stepped closer to them, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "You didn't just sell a house. You sold the trust that binds a family together. You burned the bridge behind you, and now you're surprised that the water is cold. We'll sue." Julian stammered, though even he sounded unconvinced. "We'll say you weren't of sound mind when you set up these companies. We'll fight you in court for years." "Go ahead," Elias invited, a dark glint in his eyes. "By the time you get a court date, the Phoenix Group will own your cars, your clothes, and the very ground you're standing on. I'm not just taking back what you took from me. I'm taking everything you thought you were entitled to." Sarah sank into a chair, her bravado evaporating. "Dad, please. I have a reputation. I have a life. You can't just take it all away." "I'm not taking your life, Sarah," Elias said, picking up his coat. "I'm giving you a gift. The gift of reality. You've spent your lives playing with my chips. Now, for the first time, you're going to have to play with your own. Let's see how well you build when the materials aren't free." As he walked toward the door, he paused and looked back at them. Two adults, frozen in the wreckage of their own greed. For a fleeting second, he felt a ghost of the old love he had for them, a memory of holding them as infants. But then he remembered the cold, clinical air of the hospital and the sold sign on his lawn. "Oh, and Julian," Elias added, "the audit for Apex Neural isn't just about the money. They're looking into the intellectual property theft from your former lead developer. I wonder, did you think I wouldn't notice you optimized his work too?" Julian turned a sickly shade of gray. Elias walked out into the crisp afternoon air. He had given them a chance to show remorse at the gala. They had chosen to offer him an allowance instead. The demolition was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. He checked his watch. In 48 hours, the first of the eviction notices would be served, not to a stranger, but to the very offices his children had bought with his betrayal. He climbed into the back of Marcus's car. "Any change of heart?" Marcus asked, looking at his old friend. "No," Elias said, looking straight ahead. "The walls are coming down, Marcus, and I want to make sure I'm there to watch the dust settle." The clock on the wall of Elias's hotel suite didn't tick. It glided, a silent witness to the systematic dismantling of two lives. Elias sat at his mahogany desk, the glow from 3 computer monitors reflecting in his eyes. On one screen, a countdown timer marked the minutes until the foreclosure on Sarah's downtown project became official. On the second, a live feed of the stock market showed Julian's tech company, Apex Neural, plummeting into a nose-cone dive as rumors of the federal audit leaked to the press. There was no joy in this for Elias. There was only the grim satisfaction of a master builder watching a poorly constructed edifice finally succumb to gravity. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Elias didn't need to check the security camera. He knew the rhythm of that desperate pounding. It was the sound of consequences finally catching up. He pressed a button to unlock the heavy oak door. Julian and Sarah burst in, looking like ghosts of their former selves. Julian's tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with the kind of terror only a man who has lost his safety net can feel. Sarah followed, her mascara smudged, clutching a designer handbag that now contained nothing but legal notices and unpaid bills. "Stop it, Dad. Just stop it," Julian screamed, stumbling toward the desk. "The board just fired me. They're accusing me of fraud." They said a hostile entity bought out our debt and leaked the internal memos. That was you, wasn't it? You're destroying my life. Elias didn't look up from his monitor. I didn't destroy your life, Julian. I simply stopped subsidizing your delusions. You committed the fraud. You leaked the memos through your own incompetence. I merely ensured the right people saw the truth. $10 million, Sarah sobbed, sinking onto the velvet sofa. The bank just seized the downtown site. They locked the gates. My investors are calling for my head. They're saying the Phoenix Group bought the primary lien and refused to negotiate. Dad, that's my entire career. Everything I've worked for since the accident. Since the accident, Elias repeated, finally turning his chair to face them. His gaze was like a sub-zero wind. You mean since the moment you decided your father was more valuable as a liquidation asset than as a human being? You didn't work for that career, Sarah. You bought it with the bricks of my house and the blood of my legacy. You built your success on a foundation of betrayal. Did you truly think it would hold? We're sorry, Julian shouted, the words sounding hollow and panicked. Fine, we're sorry. We shouldn't have sold the house. We shouldn't have moved you. We were scared, okay? We thought you were never coming back, and we didn't want to lose everything. You didn't want to lose your everything, Elias corrected him. You were perfectly willing to lose mine. You sold my library, Julian. Thousands of books, some signed by men who shaped the world. You sold your mother's piano, the one she played for you every night when you were a child. You sold the very roof that kept you dry for 20 years. And for what? For a lifestyle that lasted for months. We can get it back, Sarah pleaded, reaching out a trembling hand. With the money the Phoenix Group has, we can buy it all back. We can be a family again. We'll get you the best doctors, the best care. We'll move into a new place, all of us together. Elias looked at her, and for a moment, the icy mask slipped, revealing a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. You still don't understand, do you? You think this is a negotiation. You think you can buy back a soul with the same currency you used to sell it. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. A family is a structure, Sarah, like a skyscraper. It requires trust as its steel frame and love as its mortar. Once you pull out the steel and wash away the mortar, it doesn't matter how much gold you paint on the outside. It's a ruin. You turned this family into a ruin the moment you put a price tag on my life. So what now? Julian asked, his voice breaking. You're just going to leave us with nothing? You're going to watch us go to prison or live on the streets? I am doing exactly what you did to me, Elias said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I am letting the world decide your value. You thought I was effectively gone. Well, as of 9 o'clock this morning, Julian Thorne and Sarah Thorne are effectively gone from the business world. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are tied up in litigation that will last a decade. And the Phoenix Group? It has just signed a contract to turn the old Thorne estate into a public park and a community center for the elderly. Sarah let out a strangled cry. Our house, you're giving it away? It was never your house, Elias said. It was a home. And since you don't know the difference, you don't deserve to keep the walls. Elias turned back to his desk and picked up 2 small envelopes. He tossed them onto the coffee table. Inside those envelopes are bus tickets to your uncle's farm in the Midwest. He needs laborers. He offers a roof and 3 meals a day in exchange for hard, honest work. No venture capital. No real estate flipping. Just dirt and sweat. Julian looked at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. You're joking. You want us to be farmhands. It's more than you gave me, Elias said. You gave me a thin blanket in a cold room and waited for me to die. I'm giving you a chance to learn how to build something with your own hands. Whether you take it or choose to starve in the shadows of the city you tried to con, that is entirely up to you. Dad, please, Sarah whispered. The meeting is over, Elias said, returning to his monitors. The Phoenix Group has no further business with you, and neither do I. He didn't look up as they stood there, paralyzed by the sheer scale of their loss. He didn't look up when Julian finally grabbed the envelopes in a fit of shaky rage. He didn't look up when Sarah's sobs echoed down the hallway as they finally retreated. When the door clicked shut, Elias finally let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at a small, framed photograph he had kept hidden in his desk, the only thing he had managed to buy back from a private collector. It was a photo of a young Julian and Sarah sitting on his lap in the garden of the old house, laughing. He touched the glass with a withered finger. He had won. He had reclaimed his empire and exacted his price. But as the silent penthouse closed in around him, Elias Thorne realized the hardest truth of all. He was the architect of a masterpiece of revenge, but he was living in a house with no one left to call home. The city was gripped by a relentless rain that turned the streets into shimmering ribbons of black ink. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the old Thorne estate, a place that was now officially no longer a home, but a construction site for a public legacy. The new owners, a nonprofit foundation funded entirely by the Phoenix Group, had already begun the transition. The sold sign had been replaced by a plaque, the Thorne Community Sanctuary. Elias walked through the gutted west wing. The recording studio the previous buyer had started was being torn out to make way for a communal library. As he moved through the skeletal remains of the rooms, he felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't rebuilding his past. He was repurposing his pain. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Marcus. "They didn't take the bus, Elias," Marcus said, his voice heavy with a mixture of expectation and regret. "Julian tried to sell that Patek Philippe watch at a pawn shop this morning, but I had already flagged the serial number as stolen property from the estate." He was detained for questioning. Sarah is at a motel on the outskirts of the city. She tried to call a dozen friends for a place to stay. No one picked up. Elias looked at a patch of peeling wallpaper where a family portrait had once hung. "The world is very small when you have no currency to buy entry, Marcus. What do you want me to do? The police are asking if you want to press charges against Julian for the watch." Elias closed his eyes. Let him sit there for the night. Let him feel the cold iron. Tomorrow, tell them the owner declined to testify on the condition that he leaves the city immediately. As for Sarah, let the motel bill run out. She needs to understand that a designer bag cannot be traded for a roof when the world knows you're bankrupt. An hour later, Elias found himself driven to the police station. He didn't go inside. He sat in the back of the car, watching through the tinted glass as Julian was released from the side exit. His son looked broken. His expensive suit was stained, his shoulders were slumped, and he was clutching a small plastic bag of his belongings. He looked exactly like Elias had on the day of his discharge, empty-handed and discarded. Julian stood on the sidewalk, looking left and right. For the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. No one was waiting for him in a luxury SUV. No assistant was handling his schedule. He looked at his reflection in a puddle and seemed not to recognize the man staring back. Elias watched as Julian began to walk, his head down against the rain. A few blocks away, Sarah was waiting at a bus stop, her eyes red and swollen. When Julian reached her, they didn't embrace. They stood several feet apart, two strangers bound by a shared bloodline and a shared sin. "They look like ghosts, Elias," Marcus whispered from the front seat. "They are ghosts," Elias replied. "They killed the people they were meant to be the moment they decided I was dead. Now they are just shadows wandering through a city they no longer own." Elias directed the driver to follow them at a distance. He watched as they eventually found shelter under the awning of a closed-down department store. They sat on their suitcases, shivering. This was the moment of truth. This was the point where the ego either shatters or hardens into something even more monstrous. He saw Julian reach into his pocket and pull out the envelope Elias had given them, the one with the bus ticket to the farm. Julian looked at it for a long time. He looked at Sarah. She was crying silently, her head resting on her knees. Julian tore the envelope open. He didn't throw it away. He handed one of the tickets to Sarah. Elias felt a minute tremor in his chest, a spark of something he thought had been extinguished. They had finally realized that the city had no more gifts for them. They were finally looking at the dirt instead of the gold. "Are you going to go to them?" Marcus asked. "No," Elias said firmly. "If I go to them now, the lesson is lost. They will think this was just another game, another test they can pass to get back into my good graces. They need to live the life they chose for me. They need to earn their way back to humanity through the soil and the sweat." He watched as they stood up and began the long walk toward the Greyhound station. They didn't look back at the luxury car following them. They didn't know their father was watching. Elias returned to the hotel, but he didn't go to the penthouse. He went to the small, modest room he had kept on the lower floors, a room that reminded him of his early days as a struggling architect. He sat at a small wooden table and opened a ledger. He began to write, not blueprints for buildings, but a letter. "To my children," it began. "Asterisk, you thought you sold a house. You actually sold the only thing that cannot be replaced, time. I cannot give you back the months I lost in the fog, and I cannot give you back the childhoods you tarnished with greed. But I can give you the one thing I had when I started, a chance to be a man and a woman of character. Asterisk. He stopped writing. The ink pooled on the paper. He knew that part 6 was the most difficult stage of any construction, the curing of the concrete. It was the waiting period where you had to let the foundation settle before you could ever dream of building upward again. He looked at the rain lashing against the window. Somewhere out there, his children were sitting on a cramped bus, heading toward a life of anonymity and labor. For the first time since he woke up from the coma, Elias Thorne didn't feel like an avenging ghost. He felt like a father performing a radical, painful surgery to save a dying patient. The Phoenix Group is dissolved as of tomorrow, Marcus, Elias said into his phone. Transfer the remaining liquid assets into an anonymous trust for the Thorne Community Sanctuary. I want enough left for my own modest expenses, and not a penny more. And the rest? The rest stays in the ground, Elias said. If they survive the farm, if they become people I can look at without seeing my own betrayal, then, and only then, will the trust activate. But for now, let them be poor. Let them be hungry. Let them be real. Elias turned off the lights and sat in the darkness. The silence was no longer heavy. It was clean. He had cleared the site. He had removed the rot. Now, all he could do was wait and see if anything honest would grow in the ruins. 5 years had passed since the Phoenix Group vanished from the corporate headlines, and even longer since Elias Thorne had been effectively gone. The city had changed. New skyscrapers had pierced the clouds, and the name Thorne had faded from the gossip columns, replaced by the next generation of scandals and triumphs. But for Elias, time no longer moved in fiscal quarters or construction phases. It moved in the slow, rhythmic changing of the seasons. Elias lived in a small, stone cottage on the edge of the very farm where he had sent his children. He wasn't the owner, nor was he a guest. He was simply old Eli, a man who helped mend fences and kept the irrigation blueprints in order. He lived anonymously, his vast wealth sitting silent in trusts that benefited strangers. He had spent these years watching from a distance, never once making his presence known to the 2 laborers who worked the south fields. He sat on his porch as the golden hour bathed the wheat in a deep, amber glow. In the distance, 2 figures moved with practiced, weary efficiency. Julian, no longer the soft, pampered CEO, was hoisting heavy bales of hay onto a flatbed. His skin was burnt dark by the sun, his muscles lean and hard from years of honest toil. There was no gold watch on his wrist, only the calluses of a man who knew the value of a day's work. Beside him, Sarah was clearing a blocked drainage pipe. The woman who once refused to walk on anything but marble now knelt in the mud, her hands stained with earth. She didn't complain. She didn't look for a camera or a compliment. She simply worked until the water flowed clear, then wiped her brow with a dirt-streaked sleeve. Elias stood up, his joints aching with the familiar weight of age, and began the long walk toward the field. This was the moment he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind. The final inspection of the foundation he had forced them to pour in the dark. As he approached, Julian was the first to look up. He froze, a hay hook dangling from his hand. For a long second, the only sound was the wind whistling through the stalks. Julian didn't shout. He didn't beg. He simply stood taller, his chest heaving from the labor, and looked his father in the eye with a gaze that was clear, sober, and remarkably calm. "Dad," Julian said. The word didn't sound like a plea anymore. It sounded like a recognition. Sarah stood up from the ditch, her breath catching. She looked at her father, not as a bank account to be drained, but as a man she had deeply, profoundly wronged. The silence between them wasn't the cold, clinical silence of the hospital. It was the heavy, pregnant silence of a debt that could never be fully repaid, but was finally being acknowledged. "I saw the community sanctuary in the papers a few months ago," Sarah said softly, her voice steady. "It looks beautiful, Dad. You always were the best at choosing the right materials." Elias looked at his daughter, then at his son. He saw the scars on their hands and the humility in their posture. The rot was gone. The greed that had once fueled their every breath had been starved out by the reality of the soil. They had spent 5 years building nothing but their own character, and for the first time in their lives, they were actually standing on something solid. The farm is hard work, Elias said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It's honest work, Julian replied. He looked down at his calloused palms. I used to think I was building things, Dad, but I was just moving numbers around. Here, when you plant something, it either grows or it doesn't. You can't lie to the earth. You can't optimize a harvest that isn't there. Elias felt a tear escape the corner of his eye, disappearing into the creases of his weathered skin. You both stayed. I thought you would leave within a month. I thought you would hate me forever. We did hate you, Sarah admitted, stepping closer. For the first year, every time my back ached or I had to eat cabbage for the third night in a row, I cursed your name. But then, I started to remember the house. Not the value of it, but the way you used to read to us in the library. I realized we hadn't just sold your property, Dad. We had sold our own souls. And the only way to get them back was to stay right here in the mud until we were clean. Julian nodded. We don't want the money, Dad. We heard about the trusts. Keep them. We've learned how to live on what we earn. We wanted to know if you were still alive. If you were okay. Elias reached out, his hands trembling. Julian took one, and Sarah took the other. The circle was closed. It wasn't the grand, opulent family of the past, but it was something much more durable. It was a family forged in the fire of consequence and tempered by time. I am an architect, Elias whispered, pulling them into a clumsy, tearful embrace. And I have spent my whole life trying to build things that would last 100 years. But this, seeing the two of you stand here, knowing the truth of who you are, this is the only thing I've ever built that will outlive me. The sun began to set behind the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the farm. Elias Thorne, the man who had been betrayed and reborn, finally let go of the ghosts. He didn't need the penthouse, the hidden millions, or the vengeful satisfaction of the Phoenix Group. He had his children back, not as heirs, but as people. As they walked back toward the farmhouse together, the three of them silhouetted against the dying light, Elias realized that the greatest structures aren't made of stone, glass, or steel. They are made of the moments when we choose to stay when it's hard, to forgive when it's earned, and to remember that no matter how deep the betrayal, the human heart is the only foundation capable of being rebuilt from the ruins. The Thorne legacy was no longer a name on a building or a balance in a bank. It was a quiet walk home at the end of a long day's work. And for Elias, that was the most beautiful blueprint he had ever drawn. He was no longer the man who woke up alone in the cold. He was a father, finally home.